The cost of raising a child in the United States from birth to age 18 is roughly $310,000. That's the number people cite. That's the number that gets shared on social media with a shocked face emoji. But here's the thing, that number is wrong. Not because it's too high, because it's catastrophically too low. That $310,000 doesn't include college. It doesn't include the larger apartment or house you need to secure before the child even arrives. It doesn't include the income one parent loses during maternity or paternity leave. It doesn't include childcare, which in cities like New York or San Francisco now runs between $2,000 and $3,000 per month per child before the child can even walk. It doesn't include the career deceleration that happens when a parent, usually the mother, steps back from full-time work, a wage penalty that compounds across 30 years of employment. It doesn't include the fertility treatments that roughly 1 in 6 couples now require before they can even start that timer. When you add all of that up, when you actually do the accounting, the real cost of raising a single child in a mid to major American city is somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million over 20 years. And Gen Z is being asked to produce these children on an average household income that after taxes and rent and student loans leaves them with approximately nothing. So the question isn't why Gen Z isn't having kids. The question is why anyone expected they would. We're going to explain how this system actually works, how the economics of reproduction broke, when they broke, why they broke, and what it means for everything downstream. Because this is not a story about lifestyle choices or generational attitude problems. It's not about avocado toast or TikTok addiction or any of the lazy explanations that get recycled every 6 months in think pieces. It's about a machine that stopped fitting the people running it. That machine is what I want to talk about first. Imagine a machine called the standard life sequence. You go to school, you get a degree, you get a job, you get married, you buy a house, you have kids. This machine has been running since roughly 1950. For about 40 years it worked. Not perfectly, but it worked well enough that most people who entered the machine on schedule could expect to come out the other end with a family, a home, and some version of stability. You could enter the machine at 22 with a college degree and a modest salary, and by 28 or 30 have a reasonable claim on the next stage. House, family, stability. The machine had inputs and it produced outputs on a timeline that made biological sense. Then somewhere around 2008, the machine started misfiring. The inputs got more expensive, the outputs got delayed, the processing time stretched from 6 years to 12 to indefinite. And the biological clock, the one component in the entire system that absolutely does not negotiate, does not update, does not issue extensions, kept ticking at exactly the same speed it always had. That's the tension. That's what this entire video is about. The machine broke, but the biological timeline didn't get the memo. Let's go through this in 4 layers because each one is more uncomfortable than the last. The first layer is the one everyone talks about, the surface layer, the one your parents probably cite when they say kids are expensive. They're right, but they're right in the same way someone who's never seen an iceberg is right when they say icebergs are cold. Technically accurate, deeply incomplete. The sticker price of a child is not what breaks the math. It's the architecture costs. Let me explain what I mean by that. Before you can even think about having a child, you need a floor, a minimum viable setup. You need adequate housing, stable income, enough saved to absorb a crisis, and enough margin left over to actually fund the child's existence. In 1985, that floor was accessible around 25 years old. 2 people with average jobs could afford a 2-bedroom apartment or a starter home in most American cities. They could accumulate that setup in 2 to 3 years of combined income. The floor was low enough that you could step over it young enough to make biological use of it. In 2026, that floor has moved. It's moved so high that most Gen Z couples are spending their entire 20s just trying to reach it. And they're not reaching it because they're bad with money or undisciplined or distracted. They're not reaching it because the floor moved faster than wages ever could, faster than savings could compound, faster than careers could accelerate. Here's a concrete example. Take a couple, I'll call them Marcus and Jade. Both 26 years old, both college educated. Marcus makes $52,000 a year as a marketing coordinator. Jade makes $48,000 as a graphic designer. Combined gross income $100,000. That sounds reasonable. That sounds honestly like enough. In most major American cities, after federal and state taxes, they take home roughly $68,000 per year. Call it $6,000 per month combined. Rent for a two-bedroom in a major metro in 2026, between $2,400 and $3,500. Let's call it $2,800. That's already 46% of their take-home. Student loans. The average Gen Z college graduate carries $42,000 in debt. That's around $450 per month combined at minimum. Groceries, utilities, transportation, insurance, phone, basic life maintenance. Let's conservatively call that $1,200 per month. We're now at $4,450 spent before they've saved a single dollar, paid for entertainment, medical costs, or any irregular expense whatsoever. They have $1,550 left per month. That's their margin. That's the number. $1,550 is what they're supposed to use to save for a down payment on a house, build an emergency fund, invest for retirement, and eventually fund the architecture costs of having a child. A 20% down payment on a medium-priced home in the United States in 2026 is roughly $80,000. At $1,550 per month saved, which requires zero emergency, zero travel, zero car repair, zero medical bills, zero anything unexpected, it takes Marcus and Jade 4.3 years to save that down payment. That gets them to age 30. Then they have to qualify for the mortgage, buy the home, close, move, settle, and then think about having a child. They're 31 by the time the thought is even financially realistic. That's not a lifestyle choice. That's math. Now, here's where the floor metaphor gets darker, because what I just described was the optimistic version. That was two people with college degrees, stable employment, no major medical issues, no family emergencies, no layoffs, no recessions, no bad timing of any kind. Real life contains all of those things. Real life means the floor is even higher than the math says, because the math doesn't account for the chaos tax that everyone pays in their 20s. And here's the part that really stops me when I run through it analytically. That floor, that minimum viable setup, is not static. It doesn't wait for you. Every year that Marcus and Jade spend trying to reach it, the floor moves up. Home prices appreciate. Childcare costs increase. The cost of living in any city worth having a career in climbs faster than their salaries do. They are functionally running on a treadmill that speeds up every time they get within range of the edge. This is why Gen Z birth rates are in collapse. Not because Gen Z doesn't want children. Surveys consistently show the average Gen Z person wants between 1.9 and 2.3 children, almost exactly replacement level. They want kids, the floor just keeps moving. That's layer 1. Now, let's go deeper. Layer 2 is the one that nobody in mainstream media explains clearly, because it requires holding two uncomfortable ideas simultaneously. The housing crisis and the birth rate crisis are not separate problems. They're the same problem wearing different clothes. Housing is not just a place to live. For the purposes of reproduction, housing is infrastructure. You cannot have a child without space. You cannot raise a child in a studio apartment. You can try, but the data on developmental outcomes for children in severely overcrowded conditions is not encouraging. And more importantly, parents know this intuitively, even without a citation. So, the decision to have a child is directly downstream of the decision to secure adequate housing. One cannot happen in most cases without the other first. This is important, because it means that the housing affordability crisis of the last 15 years has functioned as a direct tax on reproduction. Every time a city failed to build enough housing, every time zoning laws blocked a new supply, every time neighborhood groups lobbied against density to protect their property values, every time a policy choice made housing scarcer, a certain number of potential children simply didn't get made. Not because the parents were selfish or irresponsible, because the spreadsheet said no. The median home price in the United States in 2012 was $169,000. In 2026, It sits around $430,000. It's millions of individual spreadsheets returning the same output. Not yet, not yet, not yet, until eventually the biology stops waiting. If you're watching this and you've been connecting dots you hadn't connected before, subscribe. I break down how systems actually work, not from theory but from the numbers up. It's free, it takes 1 second, and you'll understand why things are the way they are before most people even know to ask the question. Now layer 4, the one that sounds like it belongs in a podcast about shadowy forces but is actually just an incentive map. I want to ask you a clean, direct question. Who benefits from the current system? Not who designed it, not who wanted it this way. Those questions require intent, and nobody gathered in a room to plan this. Just mechanically, financially, structurally, who benefits from the fact that housing is expensive, childcare is unaffordable, and the formation of family units is delayed or prevented for a generation? 3 answers. Answer 1. Property owners and real estate investors. A generation that cannot buy homes is a generation that must rent. A generation that must rent is a generation producing reliable, growing, captive monthly cash flow for anyone who owns residential real estate. The shift of an entire generation from owners to renters, and it has been enormous. Home ownership among people under 35 has fallen dramatically since 2005, is one of the largest quiet wealth transfers in American economic history. No law produced it, no policy explicitly mandated it. The incentives just compounded into an outcome. Answer 2. Corporations who benefit from a workforce without competing domestic obligations. A childless workforce is, from a certain narrow operational perspective, more available in the short term. Childless employees don't require parental leave. They don't leave at 4:30 for school pickup. They don't take sick days to care for a feverish 3-year-old. They don't negotiate remote work out of logistical necessity. They're simply more available. This is not a stated corporate preference. No executive goes on record expressing this. But when you look at how companies structure parental leave, usually minimal and unpaid beyond FMLA requirements, how workplace culture treats parents who need flexibility, and how career advancement correlates with total hours present, you see a system that is structurally, if not intentionally, hostile to the combination of serious career ambition and young parenthood. Answer 3. Educational institutions and the student lending ecosystem that supports them. The student loan architecture has transferred an enormous quantity of financial pain from the state, which used to subsidize higher education substantially more heavily, to individual young people entering adulthood. In 1990, public university tuition at the average 4-year institution cost roughly $3,000 per year in inflation-adjusted terms. By 2026, it's over $12,000 and private schools average over $40,000. The system didn't break overnight. It shifted gradually, guided by incentives that made sense for each institution individually. Charge more, attract more research funding, build better facilities, compete for rankings, and produce collective disaster for the cohort that entered at the wrong time. The debt load doesn't disappear. It lives in the form of monthly payments that eat into margin, delay asset accumulation, and push family formation further into the future. The people operating within the system have no individual financial incentive to change it because the current structure generates enormous interest income for services and compliance from young graduates who entered the system before they could evaluate the terms clearly. None of this is intentional, and that's genuinely what makes it so hard to fight. There's no meeting room with a villain. There's no decree. It's the accumulation of policies, market incentives, and uncoordinated individual decisions that each made local sense and became systemically catastrophic in combination. Attack the incentives, not the individuals. The individuals are almost all just responding to the system they're inside. Now, let me take everything I've described and make it completely concrete, because frameworks without numbers are philosophy, and philosophy doesn't pay rent. I want to walk through a full scenario. Not Marcus and Jade this time. Let's try a significantly higher earning version just to show you that even the successful iteration of this story is still structurally broken. Devon, 29 years old, a software engineer, $110,000 per year in Seattle, Washington. Devon's partner, Cass, 30 years old, makes $80,000 as a nurse practitioner. Combined gross income, $190,000. This is a successful Gen household. Top 15% nationally, these two people are by most standards doing everything right. Washington has no state income tax. After federal taxes, their combined take-home is approximately $132,000 annually, roughly $11,000 per month. Rent for a two-bedroom in Seattle in 2026, about $3,200. Student loans, Devon carries $51,000 in engineering debt. Cass carries $73,000 from graduate medical education. Combined monthly minimum payments around $1,150. Groceries, transportation, utilities, insurance, subscriptions, and baseline life, conservatively $1,800 per month. Total fixed monthly outflow $6,150. Remaining margin $4,850 per month. They're saving around $3,000 per month after variable spending and some reasonable quality of life. $36,000 per year. A 20% down payment on a median Seattle home, median price around $620,000, requires $124,000. At their savings rate, they arrive there in 3.5 years. Devon is 32.5. Cass is 33.5. They buy the house. Mortgage payment on $620,000 at a rate around 6.5%, approximately $3,900 per month. Higher than rent, but now they have equity and the margin post-mortgage is around $3,950 per month. They decide to have a child. Pregnancy costs with decent insurance, assuming an uncomplicated delivery, $3,000 to $5,000 out of pocket. Call it $4,000. Nursery gear, initial supplies around $4,000 more. Cass takes 12 weeks of maternity leave. Federal law only guarantees unpaid leave, but her employer offers 6 weeks paid and 6 weeks at 60% pay. She loses roughly $8,000 in income over those 3 months compared to her normal earnings. First year cost before accounting for childcare, approximately $22,000 all in. Annual childcare cost in Seattle for a child under 12 months, approximately $32,000. Their post-mortgage margin is $47,400. The child cost approximately $54,000 in year 1 between childcare and initial costs. They are financially negative. They are the successful version of this story. Top 15% household income in America. 2 advanced degrees, responsible financial decisions, and they are net negative in year 1 with a single child. They adjust. Devon picks up a few contract hours. Cass's parents live 40 minutes away and can cover some care. They reduce discretionary spending significantly. Year 2 gets easier. By kindergarten, the acute crisis is over. But here's what I want you to notice, because this is the invisible cost that doesn't show up in any parenting budget calculator. During those 3 to 4 years of financial pressure, Devon and Cassie stopped investing. Their net worth accumulation went to 0 and in year 1 negative. The $36,000 annual savings rate they had built up disappeared entirely. Money not invested at 30 compounds differently than money invested at 30. $30,000 that doesn't go into an index fund at age 30 growing at an average of 8% annually doesn't exist as $318,000 at age 65. That's not a small number. That's retirement security, and it doesn't exist because year 1 with a child consumed it. Her year of missed investment multiplied by 3 years of disruption multiplied by the second child. Devon and Cassie were theoretically planning, and you start to see why the full cost of a child to a high-earning couple who is doing everything right is genuinely north of $500,000 once you include opportunity cost. Devon and Cass are the good version. They're the high-earning, dual-income, healthy, geographically lucky, family-supported, no major emergency version. Most Gen Z households are working with significantly smaller numbers and significantly less support. Here's a quick comedic illustration of what running this math feels like in real time. Imagine you're sitting across from a financial planner at 28. You tell him you're thinking about having a child in the next couple of years. He opens his laptop. He starts typing. Then he goes very quiet. Then he looks up and says in a perfectly calm, professional voice, "Mathematically, I would recommend against it." That's a 154% increase in 14 years. Over the same period, median wages grew by approximately 40%. Housing got 2.5 times more expensive. Wages got 40% better. You don't need an economics degree to see what that does to the timeline. And this is when most people get it completely backwards. They think the problem is that housing is expensive. That's true, but it's not the core problem. The core problem is that housing became an asset class instead of remaining infrastructure. This distinction matters more than anything else in this conversation. When a house is infrastructure, you want it to be affordable because affordable infrastructure means more people can use it productively. They can live near work, form families, build communities. When a house is an asset, you want it to appreciate because appreciation is the mechanism by which you grow wealthier. These two goals are directly opposed to each other. You cannot simultaneously want housing to be cheap for buyers and expensive for owners. The system has to pick a side, and for the last 30 years, it picked the asset side. The people who owned homes before 2010, a generation that is primarily boomers and older Gen 10, have seen their net worth compound dramatically because of home price appreciation. The people who didn't own homes before 2010, which includes almost all of Gen Z, are paying the price of that appreciation every single month in rent. The wealth transfer has been enormous and almost entirely invisible because it happened through a price mechanism rather than through direct taxation, which would have been politically visible and therefore politically contested. I'm not framing this as a generational attack. I'm framing it as a systems observation. The housing system is incentivized to produce expensive housing. Expensive housing delays the floor. A delayed floor delays reproduction. A delayed reproduction compounds across an entire generation. This is not a conspiracy. It's just a logical output of a set of incentives that nobody designed collectively, but everybody reinforced individually. Now, let me show you something that takes this from uncomfortable to almost absurd. The average American child care cost for one child under the age of 4 in a licensed daycare center in 2026 is roughly $23,000 per year. In San Francisco, it's around $37,000. In New York, it's around $34,000. Let's use the national average, $23,000 per year. Go back to Marcus and Jade. Their margin, the money they have left after all fixed expenses, is $1,550 per month. That's $18,600 per year. If they have a child and need childcare, the childcare alone costs $23,000. Their entire annual margin is $18,600. The childcare exceeds their total disposable income by $4,400 a year. The math doesn't just get harder, it inverts. A child makes them financially negative before a single diaper has been purchased. Technically, they could do what most families do in this situation, which is have one parent, historically the mother, reduce or eliminate work hours to avoid child care costs. But this creates what labor economists call the motherhood penalty, which is one of the most consistently documented phenomena in employment research. Women who leave the workforce for even 1 to 2 years to care for children see long-term wage penalties that compound across a career. The penalty isn't just the lost income during the break. It's the missed promotions, the missed professional network development, the skills gap, the employer bias in hiring and advancement. The long-run earnings difference between equivalent women with and without career interruptions for child care can reach hundreds of thousands of dollars over a working lifetime. So, Marcus and Jade's actual choices are pay $23,000 a year in child care they cannot afford, or have Jade exit the workforce and accept a lifetime earnings penalty that could cost her $200,000 to $300,000 in total. Neither option works cleanly on their income. Both involve a loss. The question is just which kind of loss they prefer. That's not a lifestyle choice. That's a structural trap with two bad exits. Layer 3. And this is where it moves from economics into something more psychological and honestly more interesting. I want to talk about what I call the anxiety debt spiral. That's not an official term. I made it up, but it describes something real that I think is driving birth rates down in a way that none of the standard economic models fully captures. Gen Z grew up watching 2008. Some were children during it. Some watched their parents lose jobs, lose houses, watch retirement accounts drop 40% in 8 months. They absorbed at a formative developmental age the lesson that stability is fragile, that systems fail, that you can make all the right choices and still find yourself starting over. Then they graduated, some into the pandemic crash of 2020, some into a job market that was technically recovering but felt unstable. They carried student debt that the previous generation had consistently told them was a necessary investment in degrees the market suddenly didn't value the way it once had. And then they watched inflation spike in 2022 and 2023 in a way that made their already razor-thin margins even thinner, that made rent jump 15 to 20% in a single year in some markets, that made the grocery bill go up and not come back down. The psychological effect of all of this is not depression. It's something more functional. It's a hyperactive, almost involuntary risk calculation. Gen Z does not underestimate risk. If anything, they've had enough direct experience with systemic failure that they price in risks the previous generation never thought to model. They're not pessimistic in a passive way. They're precise in an uncomfortable way. Here's the thing about having a child from a pure expected value framework. It is the single riskiest financial decision a person can make. It is an 18-plus year commitment to an uncertain level of expenditure with no exit option, no financial return in any conventional sense, and full personal liability for outcomes you cannot fully control or predict. The variance is enormous. The downside is catastrophic. From a cold expected value calculation, children are a terrible investment. Previous generations didn't run that calculation because cultural pressure, religious expectations, social norms, and the lower financial barrier made the question feel moot. You got married, you had kids, that's what you did. The flow was low enough that you stepped over it without really asking yourself whether you could. Gen Z is the first generation whose combination of financial precarity and cultural freedom, freedom from the social pressure to reproduce, freedom from the stigma of choosing differently, has allowed or forced them to run the calculation explicitly. And when you run it explicitly with honest numbers, the spreadsheet does not return a positive result. This is not nihilism, this is rationalism. The problem is that some decisions, including the decision to have children, don't survive pure rationalism. They require a threshold of financial security that makes the irrational leap feel possible. The machine used to produce that threshold, now it doesn't, and the anxiety fills the space where the security used to be. Let me make this concrete with a scenario I've observed play out in different forms many times. Imagine a woman, I'll call her Priya, 28 years old, works in technology, makes around $90,000 a year. By every standard metric, she's doing well. Top 20% of earners for her age cohort. She has $37,000 saved. She rents a one-bedroom in Austin, Texas for $1,700 a month. She has a long-term partner. She wants children. They've talked about it many times. The conversation always ends the same way. Not yet. Let's get the house first. Let's get the down payment. Let's get to a place where losing one income for 3 months doesn't feel like a cliff edge. At her current savings rate, around $1,500 a month after all expenses, she needs roughly 4.5 more years to hit a down payment for a median Austin home. She'll be 32 or 33. Then she needs to buy the house, close, move, get settled, feel stable, then think about the child. She'll be 34 when the leap becomes emotionally accessible. Fertility statistics at 34 are not alarming, but they're not what they are at 27. The window is narrowing, she knows this. It's a background hum, a constant low-grade pressure that never quite goes away. And the most structurally perverse part is that the anxiety itself is a kind of tax. It consumes mental bandwidth that could go toward career performance, toward the relationship, toward life quality. She's paying a psychological cost for a delay she did not choose and cannot easily engineer her way out of. Multiply that by millions of people making the same rational yet painful calculations across a decade, and you begin to understand what a birth rate collapse actually looks like from the inside. It's not dramatic, it's not a protest. Now, I want to talk about something that rarely gets included in this conversation at all, because it requires taking a 20-year view rather than a 5-year one. The education cost structure and what it does to the reproduction problem from the other direction. We've been talking about how expensive it is to have a child, but there's a compounding layer, the rising cost of making a child economically viable in the modern labor market. In 1975, a high school diploma was a reasonable ticket to a middle-class life. By 2000, a college degree was the new minimum. By 2020, the college degree was table stakes, necessary but not sufficient, and graduate degrees, technical certifications, professional networks, and specialized skills were increasingly the actual differentiators. The educational floor for economic self-sufficiency has risen as dramatically as the housing floor, and it means commitment of parenthood doesn't end at 18. It ends when the child is economically self-sufficient, which now takes longer than it ever has. A child who needs help through college, potentially through graduate school, and possibly through early career instability is not an 18-year commitment. It's a 25 to 28-year financial commitment. In a world where many Gen Z parents are themselves still paying off the debt from their own education during the years they would be funding a child's education, parents in their 30s and early 40s paying student loans for education they finished 10 years ago, simultaneously trying to save for a child's education that will cost substantially more in a credential environment where the return on that education is less certain than it was for any previous generation, the layers stack. And here's what makes it systemic rather than personal. Each layer, student debt, housing costs, child care costs, the extended education investment horizon, is individually explainable. Each one has causes that are reasonable to examine in isolation, but the combination of all of them landing simultaneously on a single generation in their 20s and 30s when they should be making the foundational investments of family formation is the actual crisis. It's not any single cost, it's the stack. Everything stacked at once on the same people at the same time. This is the machine failing, not dramatically, not visibly, just one delayed decision at a time multiplied by millions, producing a demographic curve that will take another decade to show its full consequences. I need to show you what those consequences actually look like because it's not abstract. Social Security, Medicare, pension systems, any pay-as-you-go entitlement structure, these systems run on a basic actuarial assumption there are meaningfully more young workers than old retirees, and the contributions of the young funds the obligations to the old. When birth rates fall and that ratio inverts, the math breaks. Fewer workers, more retirees, same obligations, either contributions have to rise substantially or benefits have to fall or the gap gets borrowed, which defers the problem with interest attached. Japan is the case study. Japan's birth rate began collapsing in the 1980s, driven by almost identical forces. Housing unaffordability in major cities, educational pressure, a dual-income household model that never developed adequate child care infrastructure, and cultural norms that placed enormous and time demands on parents. By 2025, Japan has more citizens over 65 than under 15. Its public debt exceeds 250% of GDP, partially because the demographic math broke and the government kept borrowing to cover the gap. 3 decades of economic stagnation, an aging population consuming more than the working age cohort can fund, and structural deflation. The United States is approximately 20 years behind Japan on this specific curve. The Gen Z birth rate decline is not a blip that corrects itself in the next economic cycle. It is a structural shift with a generational tail. And the policy responses that would actually address it, subsidized child care, affordable housing supply expansion, meaningful student debt restructuring, robust paid parental leave, are expensive in the near term and pay off over a generation, which means politicians operating on 2 to 4 year election cycles have very limited incentive to implement them at the required scale. The incentive is to make speeches about family values, not to spend the money that would actually lower the floor. So, the machine produces the same output year after year, declining birth rates, rising costs, delayed family formation, and an entire generation of people making individually rational decisions inside a collectively irrational system. Here's the second brief detail because it earns it. Picture a government press release, and again, not hypothetical. This is the actual genre of policy document that reads, "We are deeply concerned about declining birth rates and strongly encourage young families to consider having more children." Then the next paragraph of the same legislative session cuts funding for early childhood programs and reduces the child care tax credit and increases the interest rate on federal student loans. Not a hypothetical, a description. Now, I want to give you a framework that actually organizes the problem into something you can think about in concrete terms. I call it the 3 floors because there are actually 3 distinct floors that a Gen Z household needs to reach before reproduction becomes economically viable, and they're not the same floor. Most people collapse them into one vague sense of readiness, which is part of why the not yet feels endless. Floor 1 is the stability floor. This is the point at which a household can absorb a 3-month emergency, job loss, medical event, major unexpected expense without entering destructive debt. Before this floor, having a child is genuinely reckless from a financial risk perspective because children generate exactly these kinds of emergencies with regularity. Most financial planners define this as 3 to 6 months of living expenses in liquid savings. For a household spending $5,000 a month, that's $15,000 to $30,000. The median Gen Z household has under $8,000 in liquid savings in 2026. Most Gen Z households have not cleared floor 1. Floor 2 is the housing floor. This is the point at which a household has stable, adequately sized housing in which a child can develop normally. That doesn't require luxury. It requires a minimum 2-bedroom situation in a neighborhood with functional schools with enough financial security that the housing situation is unlikely to change drastically during the child's early years. Given home prices and income trajectories, this floor is now inaccessible for the majority of Gen Z households without external capital, a parental gift toward a down payment, an inheritance, pre-existing property. The floor requires external generational wealth for most people in most major metros, which means it's not available to the people whose families didn't accumulate that wealth. Floor 3 is the child care floor. This is the point at which a household can absorb child care costs without going financially negative. As we've established, this floor in major American cities requires either high combined income, free or subsidized family care, or one partner accepting a permanent career penalty. For a median Gen Z household, floor 3 is simply not reachable through income alone in high-cost metros. 3 floors. Most Gen Z households haven't cleared floor 1. Very few have cleared floor 2. Almost none have cleared all 3 simultaneously in age where the biological window is still optimal. The machine is producing that outcome, not because people are doing something wrong, because the floor moved and nobody moved it back. Now, what do you actually do with this? I said at the beginning we'd explain why it's getting weird. We've done that, but that's worth nothing if it doesn't connect to something actionable. I have 3 takeaways. They're different from the generic advice. The first one, treat the floor as a number, not a feeling. Most people know they need financial stability before having children. What they don't do is calculate the specific number. They have a vague sense of not being ready, and that vagueness persists indefinitely because there's no target. No target means no plan. No plan means drift. Define floor 1, 2, and 3 in exact dollar terms for your specific city, your specific income, your specific situation. When you know the number, you can build a system to reach it. When you don't know the number, you just respond to pressure. For most people, floor 1, the stability floor, is achievable within 18 months to 2 years of deliberate focus. Floor 2, the housing floor, depends heavily on geography and may require a city change. Floor 3, the child care floor, depends on a combination of income trajectory, geographic decision, and structural choices like proximity to family support. These are not easy problems, but they're solvable problems. A solvable problem behaves completely differently than an impossible one once you name it precisely. The second takeaway, geography is one of the highest leverage financial decisions you can make, and your parents never had to think about it at this level of granularity. The cost of living difference between a major coastal city and a mid-tier inland metro, places like Raleigh, Nashville, Columbus, Salt Lake City, Greenville, is enormous in 2026. You can live materially better on identical income in the right place. A remote worker earning $90,000 in Austin, Texas experiences a completely different financial reality than the same worker earning $90,000 in Nashville. The floors are lower, the margin is wider, the math on family formation is categorically more accessible. Most people don't make this calculation explicitly because they have career reasons for expensive cities or social ties or inertia. Inertia is not a strategy. If family formation is a genuine priority rather than an abstract future preference, the geographic decision deserves the same analytical attention you'd give a business investment because that's what it is. The third takeaway is the counterintuitive one, and I want you to actually sit with it rather than dismiss it on reflex. Dual income is not automatically the optimal structure for every Gen Z household thinking about family. I know that contradicts conventional financial wisdom, so let me show you why. For households where both partners earn in the middle range, combined $60,000 to $120,000, there's a real mathematical case for one partner pursuing asymmetric income growth or leverage while the other manages household costs including childcare during the early years. If one partner currently earns $48,000 and childcare for their child would cost $32,000 per year, that partner is contributing $16,000 of marginal net value to the household by continuing full-time work versus alternatives providing free childcare using reclaimed time to develop a higher leverage skill, build a business with asymmetric upside, or retrain for a higher paying role. The math sometimes, not always, but sometimes in a specific income range does not favor the dual income plus childcare structure. Run the numbers for your specific situation. Don't accept the default configuration. The default was designed for a different cost environment. Look, none of this is easy. The system is genuinely harder than it was. The floor is genuinely higher. Gen Z is genuinely receiving a worse deal than the two preceding generations on the specific question of family formation, and I'm not going to tell you otherwise because it's not true and you can see the numbers for yourself. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. At the start of this, I asked why anyone expected Gen Z to have children given the math. And the honest answer is the people who set the conditions of this machine were not running the math. They were running a different machine in a different decade where the floor was lower and the biological timeline felt irrelevant because you'd clear the floor long before biology mattered. That machine is gone. The machine that exists now is this one with this cost structure, these wages, this housing market, this childcare system, the student loan architecture. You didn't build it, but you're inside it. And the question isn't whether the machine is fair. The question is whether you understand it clearly enough to root around it. Some people figure this out not by working harder or believing more or any of the motivational language I'm never going to use, by mapping the system accurately, by choosing geography over prestige, by defining ready in numbers instead of feelings, by making structural household decisions based on what the math actually supports rather than what the cultural template says you're supposed to do. The floor is high, that's real, but it's still a floor, not a ceiling. The difference between those two words is enormous. A ceiling is something you can't get past. A floor is something you have to reach first. High, yes. Moving up, yes. But beneath it, on the other side, the machine still works the way it was designed to work. If you enter it at the right time with the right architecture in the right place, the machine broke. Most people are still trying to run it the old way in the old sequence in cities that no longer fit the inputs. You don't have to do that, but you have to see it clearly first. That's the whole thing. Subscribe. I publish exactly this. No performance, no motivation, just the mechanics of how things actually work, and it's worth your time.